Oh, that's just Grace. She's helping coordinate logistics, kind of like part of the event team. The words sliced through the champagne-soaked air like a blade through silk. Grace stood 20 feet away, close enough to hear every syllable, far enough that her sister didn't bother to lower her voice. $400,000. 15 years of sacrifice. And in one careless sentence, she'd been reduced to hired help at her own sister's wedding. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Grace had spent 2 decades in the army learning to read a room, and this one was crystal clear. They believed it. Every single one of them believed she was staff. But what they didn't know, what her sister Maya had conveniently forgotten, was that the woman standing in the shadows, holding the champagne glass, wasn't just a logistics coordinator. She was the one holding every contract, every invoice, every dollar that made this fairy tale possible. And she'd just decided it was time they all learned the difference between performance and power. When Captain Grace Sullivan returned to Ohio after 15 years of military service, she carried more than just her duffel bag and discharge papers. She carried the weight of every supply convoy she'd led through hostile territory, every soldier she'd kept fed and equipped, every impossible deadline she'd somehow met. What she expected was quiet mornings with strong black coffee, maybe some consulting work, and the kind of peace that only comes after spending too many years in sand, steel, and the constant hum of diesel engines. What she didn't expect was her phone ringing at 7 in the morning with her younger sister's voice on the other end, bright and breathless in a way that immediately put Grace on alert. Maya's tone had that slightly forced cheerfulness that Grace remembered from childhood. The voice Maya used when she wanted something but didn't want to ask directly. "Grace, I have the most incredible news. I'm getting married." Grace set down her coffee mug, still surrounded by half-unpacked boxes in her new apartment. The place smelled like fresh paint and possibility. "That's wonderful, Maya." "Who's the lucky guy?" "His name is Christopher Hartwell," Maya said, and there was a pause that felt loaded with expectation. "His family is in real estate." "Old family, if you know what I mean." "The ceremony will be at the Hartwell estate in Connecticut." Grace didn't need to Google anything to understand what old family meant in Connecticut. It meant money that had been around so long people stopped counting it. It meant a world where summer was a verb and connections mattered more than credentials. Still, she kept her voice warm and supportive. "I'll be there. Just tell me the date and what you need from me." There was a pause on the line, brief but significant. Grace recognized that pause. She'd heard it in briefing rooms when someone was about to deliver bad news they'd been rehearsing. "Well, about that," Maya began, her voice dropping into a more careful register. "Things are getting expensive. The venue alone is close to $200,000. But don't worry, I'll pay you back. Eventually." Grace almost laughed. She set her mug down more carefully this time. "Maya, it's a wedding, not a military operation. How many guests are you planning?" The answer came quickly, rehearsed. "About 300, maybe 350. I know it sounds like a lot, but the Hartwells, they move in certain circles. First impressions matter. This isn't just a wedding, Grace. It's an introduction." Grace understood certain circles better than Maya probably realized. She'd spent years navigating rooms full of generals, defense contractors, and politicians who all played different versions of the same power game. Influence through image. Control through perception. "I'll cover it," Grace said simply, the words coming out before she'd fully thought them through. "Send me the vendor information." The squeal of delight that followed was so loud Grace had to pull the phone away from her ear. "Are you serious, Grace? I can't ask you to—" "You didn't ask," I offered. "Just get me the details." That was how Captain Grace Sullivan, veteran of 2 deployments, logistics officer who'd once kept an entire forward operating base supplied through a sandstorm that lasted 4 days, ended up financing a wedding that could have covered her salary for 3 years. She justified it to herself in the days that followed. Maya had been only 12 when Grace enlisted, barely more than a child trying to process their parents' sudden deaths in a car accident. Grace had been 20, thrust into the role of guardian while also trying to figure out her own future. The army had been her solution, a way to provide structure and income while giving Maya stability. Every extra dollar Grace earned went home. Private school tuition, college expenses, the deposit on Maya's first apartment in Manhattan. This wedding was just another form of protection, another way of making sure her little sister had the life their parents would have wanted for her. 3 months later, Grace drove her black pickup truck through the gates of the Hartwell estate in Greenwich. The driveway alone seemed longer than some of the roads she'd travelled in Iraq. She parked next to a row of luxury vehicles that probably cost more than most houses in Ohio. Mercedes sedans, Range Rovers, and one vintage Bentley that looked like it belonged in a museum. The security guard at the entrance took one look at her military license plates and tried to redirect her to the service entrance. Grace smiled politely, showed him the vendor authorization with her name on it, and drove straight past him to the main parking area. She'd dealt with far more intimidating gatekeepers than a man in a polo shirt with a clipboard. Inside the mansion, she found Maya standing with a cluster of women who all looked like they'd stepped out of the same catalogue. Pastel dresses, designer handbags, champagne flutes held at the perfect angle. They were discussing flower arrangements with the kind of intensity most people reserved for matters of life and death. Maya saw Grace first. For just a fraction of a second, her face lit up with genuine happiness. Then something shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Her expression rearranged itself into something more careful, more controlled. "Grace, you made it," Maya said, walking over with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You look so official." Grace glanced down at her dark jeans and simple button-down shirt. She'd left the uniform behind, but apparently not the bearing. "I figured combat boots might clash with the roses," she said lightly. A few of the bridesmaids tittered at that. Maya's smile tightened. "Everyone. This is my sister," she announced to the group, her hand gesturing vaguely in Grace's direction. "She works in logistics, military background." The phrasing struck Grace immediately. Not, "she served our country," or "she's a veteran." Just military background, delivered in the same tone someone might say, "she works in retail," or "she's between jobs." One of the bridesmaids, a blonde woman with perfect teeth and a pearl necklace, smiled brightly. "Oh wow, that's so interesting. Thank you for your service." The words came out automatic, practiced the way people say "bless you" after a sneeze. "It was an honor," Grace replied evenly, though the phrase felt hollow in this marble-floored mansion where sacrifice meant choosing between two catering companies. Maya redirected quickly. "Anyway, we were just finalizing some details with the florist. Grace, can we catch up later? I'm a bit swamped right now." Grace recognized a dismissal when she heard one. She'd been dismissed by people with far more authority and far better reasons. But coming from Maya, it carried a different sting. "Sure," she said quietly. "I'll find the wedding planner." She walked away, heading toward the back terrace where tables and chairs were being arranged by a crew of workers. Behind her, Maya's laughter rang out, bright and performative. Grace had heard that same laugh countless times growing up, usually when Maya was trying to impress someone or hide discomfort. The sound used to make Grace smile. Now it just made her tired. She found the wedding planner near the garden, a woman named Claire who carried a tablet like it contained state secrets. Claire's demeanor changed the moment she realized who Grace was. "Miss Sullivan," she said, her voice shifting from brisk efficiency to careful deference. "Thank you so much for meeting with me. I wanted to confirm the final payment schedule." Grace pulled out her phone and opened the banking app. "I transferred the initial $200,000 last week. The remaining $200,000 will be processed 1 week before the ceremony, as agreed." Claire nodded rapidly, making notes on her tablet. "Perfect. And just to confirm, you'll be attending as a guest, correct? Not part of the planning team?" The question landed oddly. Grace looked up from her phone. "I'm her sister. Of course I'm a guest." "Right, of course," Claire said quickly, though something in her expression suggested she'd been told otherwise. "I just wanted to make sure we had the seating arrangements correct." That night, Grace checked into a modest hotel outside Greenwich. She could have afforded something nicer. The military pension combined with her new consulting company meant money wasn't tight, but years of sleeping on cots and truck beds had permanently altered her definition of comfort. She didn't need Egyptian cotton sheets or a minibar. She needed quiet and a door that locked. She opened her laptop and reviewed the vendor contracts one more time. Every signature line bore her name: catering, photography, music, floral design, venue rental. Each one represented hours of negotiations and careful coordination. Maya might be the bride, but Grace was the one making sure the engine actually ran. The realization settled over her slowly, uncomfortably. She'd been doing this for 15 years, keeping things running while Maya built her life. And somewhere along the way, the roles had calcified into something neither of them questioned anymore. Grace was the provider. Maya was the beneficiary. It had worked when Maya was a teenager navigating grief. But now, Now Maya was 27, successful, about to marry into wealth. And still Grace was writing the checks. She closed the laptop and stared at the bland hotel art on the wall. For the first time in a long while, she let herself acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding. She wasn't just financing a wedding. She was buying a place in her sister's life. And judging by the way Maya had introduced her today, it wasn't working. The next morning, Grace returned to the estate. The transformation was already underway. White tents rose like sails across the lawn. Lighting technicians strung cables between trees. Everywhere she looked, people were building something beautiful out of raw materials and careful planning. It reminded her of setting up forward operating bases. Except here the stakes were vanity instead of survival. She found Maya near the main tent, deep in conversation with Christopher's parents. Stuart and Diane Hartwell looked exactly like their name suggested. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed. Radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having worried about money. Stuart extended his hand when he saw Grace approaching. "You must be the military sister," he said, his grip firm but perfunctory. "Maya's told us about your service. Quite the sacrifice you're making for family." Grace shook his hand, matching his pressure exactly. "Service is what we do, sir. The sacrifice is just part of the job." He smiled like he understood, but Grace could see he didn't. To him, sacrifice probably meant skipping a vacation or settling for last year's car. He had no frame of reference for what she'd actually given up. "Well," Diane chimed in, her voice carrying that particular pitch of wealthy condescension. "We're just thrilled Maya has such a supportive sister. Family is everything, don't you think?" "Absolutely," Grace said, though she was starting to wonder if the Hartwells' definition of family matched her own. She watched them walk away, already moving on to the next social obligation. In their world, she realized, she wasn't Maya's sister or a veteran or even a person. She was a detail, useful background information that made Maya's story more compelling. The girl who raised herself and her sister after their parents died. Inspiring, photogenic, easily summarized in a toast. As Grace turned back toward the house, she caught sight of her reflection in one of the tent's glass panels. Short hair, weather-worn face, posture that would never fully relax. She looked like exactly what she was, someone who'd spent too many years in places where image didn't matter because survival did. And for the first time, standing in the middle of a $400,000 wedding she was paying for, Grace wondered if maybe Maya had been right to keep her at arm's length. Not because Grace didn't belong, but because she reminded everyone that belonging sometimes costs more than money can buy. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of nervous energy that Grace recognized from pre-mission briefings. Everyone moving with purpose, voices low and controlled, trying to project calm while internally running through worst-case scenarios. Grace arrived early wearing a navy suit she'd bought specifically for the occasion. Simple, elegant, expensive enough to pass inspection but not so flashy that it drew attention. She parked in the guest lot this time, avoiding another confrontation with security. Inside, the ballroom had been transformed into something from a magazine spread. White orchids cascaded from the chandeliers. Candles flickered against mirrored walls. A string quartet warmed up in the corner, their instruments gleaming under soft, amber light. Grace stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in. She'd helped build this. Every flower, every candle, every note of music existed because she'd signed the checks and approved the invoices. She found Maya in the bridal suite, surrounded by makeup artists and bridesmaids. Her sister's dress was extraordinary, layers of ivory silk that caught the light like water. Maya looked every inch the perfect bride, poised and radiant. When she spotted Grace in the doorway, her smile faltered just slightly. "Grace." "Hi. You look nice." "Thanks," Grace said, staying near the threshold. "I just wanted to check in before things get started." Maya glanced at the bridesmaids, then back at Grace. When she spoke, her voice had that careful quality again. "Listen, today is going to be a bit chaotic. The Hartwells have a lot of guests coming. Important people. Could you just keep things low-key? Some of them don't really understand the whole military thing." Grace felt something cold settle in her chest. "The whole military thing," she repeated flatly. "You mean the career that paid for this day?" One of the bridesmaids suddenly became very interested in her phone. Maya's cheeks flushed. "Don't make this difficult, please. Just let me have this day without complicating it." Grace looked at her sister for a long moment. She saw the tension in Maya's shoulders, the barely concealed anxiety behind her perfect makeup. This wasn't cruelty, she realized. It was fear. Maya was terrified of not measuring up, of these wealthy people seeing through the carefully constructed image she'd built. And Grace, with her blunt honesty and inability to perform, was a threat to that image. "It's your day," Grace said finally. "I won't complicate it." She turned and left before Maya could respond, walking through the mansion's ornate hallways with measured steps. Years of military discipline kept her face neutral, even as something painful twisted in her chest. She wasn't angry. She was something worse than angry. She was disappointed. The ceremony began at 4 o'clock. Grace took her assigned seat in the garden, table 22, positioned near the back, behind a decorative column that partially blocked the view. Her name card read Miss G. Sullivan in small understated print. She sat alone at a table meant for 8, watching as guests filed past in designer clothes and expensive jewelry. Everyone else seemed to know each other, trading air kisses and practiced compliments. Grace was an island of silence in a sea of social performance. When Maya walked down the aisle, Grace stood with everyone else. Her sister looked beautiful, ethereal, like something out of a dream. The guests sighed appreciatively. Cameras flashed. Christopher waited at the altar with an expression that was probably meant to convey deep emotion but mostly looked nervous. Grace watched it all with the detached observation she'd learned in hostile environments. Take in the details. Note the patterns. Stay alert. The ceremony was blessedly brief. When it ended and the guests erupted in applause, Grace clapped along with them. Her hands came together with the same measured precision she brought to everything. Steady. Controlled. Revealing nothing. Cocktail hour was worse than the ceremony. Grace approached the bar for a drink and found herself standing next to an older man in an expensive suit. He glanced at her, then past her, clearly looking for someone more important. "Excuse me," he said without really looking at her. "Staff should use the service entrance for refreshments." Grace turned to face him fully. "I'm not staff. I'm with the bride." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, my apologies." You thought wrong," Grace said pleasantly, taking her drink and walking away. She found a quiet corner near the edge of the terrace and watched the social choreography unfold. This was a different kind of battlefield, she realized. No bullets, no explosions, just 1,000 tiny cuts delivered with smiles and perfect manners. She'd survived worse, but somehow this felt more exhausting. Then she heard it. One of Maya's bridesmaids, the blonde from earlier, was holding court with a small group near the ice sculpture. "It's such an inspiring story," the woman was saying, her voice carrying across the terrace. "Maya's parents died when she was young, and she practically raised herself. Built this incredible life from nothing." Grace's grip tightened on her glass. She waited for Maya to correct the narrative, to acknowledge the truth. Instead, her sister just smiled modestly, sipping champagne like the lie was a compliment she'd graciously accepted. Someone in the group asked, "Who's that woman over there?" "The one in the suit." Maya's laugh was light, casual. "Oh, that's just Grace. She's helping coordinate logistics, kind of like part of the event team." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She stood there, frozen, as laughter rippled through the group. Light, thoughtless laughter that said they'd accepted the lie without question. She'd been erased. 15 years of sacrifice, $400,000. Countless hours of planning and coordination. And she'd been reduced to hired help in a single careless sentence. Grace set down her glass very carefully. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Years of training had taught her how to absorb impact without showing it. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. She pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. The final payment was scheduled to process at 9 that evening. $200,000. One tap could delay it. Another could cancel it entirely. She looked back through the glass wall at the celebration inside. Maya was glowing under the chandeliers, accepting congratulations from guests who had no idea they were applauding an illusion. Christopher's family was making the rounds, shaking hands, playing their parts in the performance. Everyone looked so happy, so convinced of the fairy tale they were witnessing. Grace's thumb hovered over the screen. She could end this right now. One button and the entire fantasy would collapse. But she didn't press it. Not yet. Because Grace had learned something crucial during 20 years of military service. Power isn't about making noise or throwing punches. It's about patience. It's about knowing exactly when to act and when to wait. These people had underestimated her. They'd looked at her short hair and plain suit and military bearing, and they'd decided she was irrelevant. Let them keep thinking that. Let them keep celebrating. Because in logistics, the person controlling the supply chain always has the real power. And Grace Sullivan had just decided it was time to remind everyone what happens when that power gets withdrawn. She put her phone away and walked back into the ballroom. Dinner was about to be served. The real show was about to begin. And this time, Grace wasn't going to stay silent in the shadows. This time, she was going to let her sister's perfect world collapse under its own weight. All she had to do was step back and watch it fall. The dinner progressed with the kind of orchestrated perfection that only money can buy. Each course arrived like clockwork, presented by servers who moved like dancers, efficient and invisible. Grace watched it all from her table in the back, declining conversation attempts from the few guests who wandered her way. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to witness the culmination of $400,000 and 15 years of enabling. Around her, conversations flowed about summer homes in the Hamptons, private schools, and the kind of problems that only existed when basic survival was never a concern. Someone complained about their yacht maintenance. Another person lamented the difficulty of finding good household staff. Grace sipped her water and said nothing, her expression carefully neutral. The speeches began after the main course. Christopher's father stood first, his voice booming with practiced confidence. "When my son first told me about Maya," he began, "I knew immediately that she was special. She has grace, ambition, and most importantly, she comes from good people. Strong values. The kind of upbringing that shapes character." Grace's jaw tightened slightly. Good people. Strong values. As if he had any idea what Maya's upbringing had actually been like. The caseworkers. The tight budgets. The nights Maya cried herself to sleep missing their parents. But of course he didn't know any of that, because Maya had carefully edited it all out of her story. Then came the moment that would be Grace's undoing. Christopher's father raised his glass and gestured toward a well-dressed older man sitting near the front. "I'd like to particularly thank Richard Montgomery, Maya's father, for raising such an extraordinary young woman. To have overcome such adversity and still taught his daughter such grace and dignity, that's the mark of a true parent." The applause was thunderous. Guests rose to their feet. Richard Montgomery, clearly confused but too polite to correct anyone, stood awkwardly and waved. Maya's eyes glistened with tears as she mouthed, "Thank you," in his direction. And Grace understood. Maya hadn't just hidden her past. She'd replaced it entirely. Rewritten it with a more palatable narrative featuring a distinguished father who'd guided her through life's challenges. The orphan story was gone. The veteran sister who'd sacrificed everything was gone. In their place was a tidy fiction that photographed better. Grace's phone buzzed in her lap. The payment reminder. $200,000 waiting for authorization. Her finger found the cancel button. One tap. That's all it would take. But she still didn't press it, because she'd just realized something important. This wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about respect, about acknowledgement, about Maya finally understanding what she'd taken for granted all these years. And money alone wouldn't teach that lesson. Grace stood up from her table. She didn't storm toward the stage or raise her voice. She simply walked with calm, measured steps toward the front of the room. Her footsteps were quiet on the carpet, but somehow the room began to notice. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. There was something in her bearing, that military presence that commanded attention without demanding it, that made people instinctively stop and watch. She reached the front where Christopher's father still stood at the microphone. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but carrying. "I need to correct something." Christopher's father blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, are you with the event staff?" "I'm Grace Sullivan," she said, taking the microphone from his hand with polite firmness. "Maya's sister, the only family she has left." The room went completely silent. Maya's face drained of color. "And I need to clarify a few things before this goes any further." Grace turned to face the crowd. 350 pairs of eyes stared back at her. She'd addressed larger groups before, soldiers awaiting orders. But this felt different. This felt personal. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, nodding to the confused man at the front table. "You seem like a fine gentleman. But you didn't raise Maya. You didn't sit up with her when she had nightmares about our parents' accident. You didn't work 2 jobs to keep her in private school when she was 13. You didn't send care packages from overseas or video call from military bases in the middle of the night just to help her with homework. That was me." The silence deepened, became almost physical. Someone coughed nervously. A glass clinked somewhere in the back. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's evening," Grace continued, her voice steady. But I'm also not going to sit quietly while my sister rewrites history to make it more palatable for an audience. Maya found her voice weak and trembling. Grace, please. Not here. Where then? Grace asked, turning to look at her directly. Should I have brought this up when you introduced me as logistics support? When you seated me at table 22 behind a column? When you let someone else accept credit for raising you? Tears were streaming down Maya's face now, cutting tracks through her carefully applied makeup. You don't understand. These people don't care about you, Grace said, not cruelly but matter-of-factly. They care about the story you tell and the image you project. I cared about you when you had nothing to offer but grief and need. I cared about you when caring cost me career opportunities and relationships and years of my life. And you thanked me by pretending I didn't exist. Diane Hartwell stood abruptly. This is completely inappropriate. Grace turned to her calmly. What's inappropriate is hosting a $400,000 wedding on someone else's money and not acknowledging them. What's inappropriate is letting your son believe his wife's success story when the woman who made it possible is eating dinner in the back. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Christopher stared at Maya, his expression shifting from confusion to something harder. Is that true? Your sister paid for this? Maya's silence was answer enough. Grace set the microphone down gently on the podium. I'm not asking for gratitude, she said quietly, speaking directly to Maya now. I'm asking for honesty. I'm asking you to stop being ashamed of where you came from. Because that's shame? It's the most expensive thing about this whole evening. And it's the only bill I won't pay. She turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted silently, guests pressing back against their chairs to let her pass. Grace made it halfway across the ballroom before Maya's voice stopped her. Wait. Grace paused but didn't turn around. I'm sorry, Maya said, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. You're right about all of it. Grace finally looked back. Her sister stood at the front of the room. Mascara streaked, trembling, but for the first time all evening, completely real. I was ashamed, Maya continued, speaking to the room now. Not of Grace. Never of Grace. I was ashamed of needing her. Of not being the self-made success story everyone wanted me to be. My sister gave up everything so I could have this life. And I thanked her by making her invisible. She walked toward Grace, her expensive dress whispering against the floor. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. Please. Grace looked at her sister, really looked at her, and saw beneath the makeup and silk to the scared 12-year-old who'd clung to her after their parents died. The girl who'd asked if they'd be okay. The girl Grace had promised to protect no matter what. I love you, Grace said quietly. I always have. But love doesn't mean enabling you to run from the truth. Maya nodded, tears flowing freely now. I know. I'll do better. I swear I'll do better. Grace didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pulled out her phone, opened her banking app, and cancelled the pending payment. The room was silent enough that several people heard the soft chime confirming the transaction. What did you just do? Christopher's father demanded. I cancelled the final payment, Grace said calmly. $200,000. Consider it a wedding gift with one condition. She looked at Maya. No more lies. No more pretending. You tell the truth about your life, all of it, or we're done. Really done. Maya nodded vigorously. Yes, anything. I promise. Grace studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once. She turned to the wedding planner, who'd been standing frozen near the wall. Claire, please coordinate with all remaining vendors. Tell them Captain Sullivan authorizes full payment as originally agreed. There will be no interruption to services. Claire's relief was visible. Yes, ma'am. Right away. Grace looked back at the crowd one final time. I apologize for the disruption. Please enjoy the rest of your evening. Then she walked out, her footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. The night air outside was cool and clean, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. Grace stood on the mansion steps, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of 15 years finally lifting from her shoulders. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Maya rushing out, still in her wedding dress. Where are you going? Maya asked breathlessly. Home. You have a party to finish. I don't care about the party. Maya grabbed her arm. Grace, I mean it. I'm sorry. Not just for tonight. For everything. For taking you for granted. For being ashamed of us. Grace softened slightly. I know you are. But Maya, being sorry isn't enough. You need to figure out who you actually are. Not who you think these people want you to be. Will you help me? Maya asked, her voice small. Will you still be my sister? I never stopped being your sister, Grace said, even when you stopped acknowledging it. They stood there in silence for a moment, the sounds of the party drifting out through the open doors behind them. Finally, Maya spoke again. I don't know how to fix this. You start by going back in there, Grace said. You finish your wedding. You smile and thank people and play the role. But tomorrow you call me, and we start being honest with each other. Really honest. Maya nodded, wiping her eyes carefully. Tomorrow, I promise. Grace watched her sister walk back inside, the silk dress catching the light one last time before disappearing through the doors. Then she got in her truck and drove away, leaving behind the mansion, the party, and the fairy tale that had cost more than money could ever measure. The real work of rebuilding their relationship would start tomorrow. But tonight, Grace allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Free. The morning after the wedding, Grace woke to 73 missed calls and twice as many text messages. She ignored all of them except one from Maya. Can we talk? Please? Grace made coffee, sat at her kitchen table, and texted back a single word, yes. Maya arrived an hour later, still looking shell-shocked, wearing borrowed clothes because she'd left the Hartwell estate with nothing but her wedding dress. Grace let her in without comment and poured her a cup of coffee. They sat across from each other in silence for a long moment. Christopher wants an annulment, Maya finally said. His parents think I'm a fraud. Most of the guests left early. The ones who stayed just wanted to gossip. It was a disaster. Was it? Grace asked quietly. Or was it just honest? Maya looked up, eyes red from crying. How can you be so calm about this? Because I've seen actual disasters, Grace said. People dying. Families destroyed by war. This isn't a disaster, Maya. This is just consequences. Maya flinched but didn't argue. I ruined everything. You ruined an illusion, Grace corrected. The question is, what are you going to build in its place? Over the following weeks, that question drove everything. Maya moved back to Ohio, taking a small apartment near Grace's place. She couldn't afford anything in Manhattan anymore, and the Hartwells had made it clear she wasn't welcome in their social circle. At first, Maya was devastated, mourning the life she'd lost. But slowly something shifted. Grace offered her a job at Sullivan Logistics, her growing consulting company. Nothing fancy, just basic administrative work. Maya hesitated at first, pride warring with necessity. But Grace's terms were non-negotiable. You want to work for me? Fine. But you start at the bottom. Same pay as everyone else. No special treatment. Maya took the job. The first few weeks were brutal. She'd never worked in an environment where results mattered more than image. Her expensive Manhattan wardrobe was useless in a warehouse setting. Her practiced charm meant nothing to truck drivers and inventory managers who cared only about getting shipments delivered on time. But Grace watched something remarkable happen. Stripped of the performance, Maya started to find herself. She learned about supply chains and logistics. She stayed late not to impress anyone, but because she wanted to understand the work. She asked questions. She made mistakes and fixed them. She slowly, painfully earned the respect of her co-workers. 6 months later, Grace found Maya in the warehouse after hours, reorganizing a filing system that had been a mess for years. You didn't have to do this, Grace said. Maya looked up, tired but genuinely pleased. I know. But it needed doing, and I figured out a better system. Check it out. She walked Grace through her reorganization, explaining the logic with genuine enthusiasm. Grace felt something warm unfold in her chest. This was the sister she'd always hoped Maya could be, capable, confident, real. You're good at this, Grace said. Maya smiled, a little embarrassed. I'm learning from the best. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Maya said, I never thanked you properly. For everything. Not just the wedding, though God knows you had every right to burn that bridge. But for raising me. For never giving up on me even when I gave up on myself. You don't need to thank me, Grace said. You're doing the work now. That's enough. But Maya shook her head. It's not enough. I need to say it. You sacrificed your 20s and half your 30s to give me a chance at life. You put your own dreams on hold. And I repaid you by treating you like an embarrassment. That's unforgivable. Maybe, Grace acknowledged. But I'm forgiving it anyway. Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to anger is exhausting. And I've been angry long enough. Maya's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. I'm going to spend the rest of my life earning your forgiveness. Don't make it your life's work, Grace said with a slight smile. Just be honest. With me, with yourself, with everyone. That's all I've ever wanted. A year later, Sullivan Logistics had grown significantly, largely due to Maya's unexpected talent for client management. She'd taken everything she'd learned about reading people in Manhattan and applied it to business development, building relationships based on genuine competence rather than social performance. Grace promoted her to operations manager. Some of the longer-term employees grumbled about nepotism until they saw Maya's results. She consistently exceeded targets, solved problems creatively, and earned client loyalty through reliability rather than charm. One evening, after closing a particularly difficult contract, Grace and Maya sat on the roof of their office building, watching the sun set over Ohio. "You know what's funny?" Maya said. "I spent years trying to escape this place, trying to become someone impressive. And now I'm back here, doing real work, and I've never been happier." "That's because this is real," Grace said. "Everything in Connecticut was performance. This is substance." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "I saw Christopher's mother in the news last week. Some charity gala. She looked exactly the same. Perfect hair, perfect dress, that same smile that never reaches her eyes." "Do you miss it?" Grace asked. "The parties? The wealth?" Maya considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it. Everything was laid out, every expectation clear. But I don't miss the person I was becoming. That woman was hollow. She looked good in photographs but had nothing underneath." "And now?" Grace prompted. "Now I have calluses on my hands and warehouse dust in my hair," Maya said with a laugh, "but I can look at myself in the mirror. That's worth more than all the Hartwell money combined." They sat in comfortable silence as the city lights began to flicker on below them. Grace felt a peace she hadn't known she was missing. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of genuine connection. "Thank you," Maya said quietly, "for not giving up on me, for loving me enough to let me fail." "That's what family does," Grace replied simply. And this time Maya didn't flinch at the word. She just nodded and smiled, finally understanding what it actually meant. Not performance or obligation or transactional support, but showing up, being honest, and choosing each other even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. 2 years after the wedding, Grace received an invitation in the mail. It was simple. Printed on plain cardstock, Maya Sullivan cordially invites you to celebrate her partnership promotion at Sullivan Logistics. Grace smiled, tucked the invitation into her desk drawer next to Maya's apology note from years before, and thought about how far they'd both come. The path hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks and arguments and moments when the gulf between them seemed unbridgeable. But they'd done something rare and difficult. They'd built something real out of the wreckage of performance. And in the end, that was worth more than any fairy tale wedding could ever be. It was messy and imperfect and absolutely true, just like family should be.